Excerpt from the 717th interview report of April 4, 2019, translated with DeepL.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. Source:
Zeitzeichen
125 on page 1 to 20.
Today I have a lot to say anyway, which is unpleasant, because while checking the conversation reports, which you retrieve after our conversation over a longer period of time and record in the computer, it turned out that in the 669th conversation report of January 1, 2017 regarding the predictions of my father's faith, these are unfortunately extremely incomplete. I am aware that this does not correspond to your inattentiveness or guilt, for I know of your correctness and diligence in all the things you deal with. And since we also know that the sectarian energies and forces that affect all your work cause malignant disturbances and that texts that have already been written down are also deleted or falsified, as I personally have been able to experience on several occasions, as well as several core group members themselves, the matter is clear to me. What you have written, I will take from your computer, and besides, since we have mentioned the whole thing, you can connect it here to my words, with which it can be read later also by all interested persons.
Good, then I'll do that. But what about the 669th contact report and your father Sfath's predictions?
I need some time for that now, because I have here everything I have recorded that you now have to see from my father's prediction from 1947. As I myself saw in January 2017, you had called up and written down the entire conversation report, but apparently shortly afterwards it was impaired by the pernicious sectarian energetic influences and disturbances, and much of it was changed and deleted. Consequently, you then made the written expression and distributed it to the KG members without noticing that the predictions had been sectarian energetically manipulated and no longer corresponded to what I had offered you from my father's annals, and you then also called it up and wrote it down, as I myself had seen. For this reason it is necessary that I now present everything to you again, that you look through my recording and then some other time call up the whole thing and record it in writing, but in a special way in order to be able to control the repeated written record down to the last detail before you pass it on again.
Of course I will do that, but it will probably be necessary, at least for contact report readers outside the core group, to explain what it is all about. That sectarian energetic forces very often disrupt my work and sometimes even destroy it. This will be difficult to explain, however, because the whole of the readership will seem so crazy that it will probably at least be seen as fibbing, or worse as confusion of consciousness and madness on my part, etc. It is also possible that the 669th contact report has already been published in Block 15, which would not be very pleasing. But I have to ask Bernadette, because she makes the blocks. Nevertheless, I think it is a good thing that from time to time you review and control the reports of the conversations, because only by doing so can you discern such perfidies which are caused by these sectarian energetic vibrations, the existence and work of which not even the best earthly scientists have any idea. That will stay that way for a long time. But let us now deal with the tiresome thing with which I want to begin here and for which your attention is required. What we have to discuss is not to be called up by you later and not to be written down, but only the complete testimonies of my father Sfath.
If it's all right with you, you could arrange everything for me in such a way that when I call up the conversation report, everything is characterized in such a way that I can recognize all unusual and newly added passages, etc., and mark them in the computer with a color, preferably red.
But your idea is grasping. Ni will do what you suggest so that Safnat Panach can pick up your idea. But no we should start working, because it will take some time and your attention. and nå vi begin with your finished headline for the predictions of Ptaah.
Prediction of Sfath at the Contact Report on Saturday, June 14, 1947.
Earthmen, humanity will weep in the time to come, because there will be sad things, events, wars, terrorism, and destruction in the times to come through its own guilt. An ever more and increasingly emerging religious sectarian delusion of faith will in the future promote the apostasy or the renunciation of the true knowledge of reality and the resulting truth. This will be accompanied by disregard for the natural creative laws, and this defection will lead to the worst of evils of the future, as was the case in ancient times through the bloody sectarian religious wars. But in future times everything will be much more disastrous than before. In particular, before the end of the 20th century, the Islamic delusion of faith will spread worldwide, with hundreds of thousands of people murdered, women raped and impregnated, and irreparable destruction caused by a particularly degenerate criminal and terrorist form, that is Islamist/Islamismus. Especially in the Nordic countries of Europe, above all in Germany, large masses of refugees from Islamic countries will invade and settle, especially by calls of an irresponsible ruler, who will cause mass exodus of people especially from Africa, Arabia and Near East. It will be that the delusion of faith will become more and more fanatical, and will become a problem for the believers, because they will completely lose the sense for the reality and truth of the actual reality in their faith imagination. And this will have the consequence that especially in Europe, especially in the rebuilt Germany, and in the countries of a dictatorship emerging in Europe, whose seat will be in Brussels, the Islamic delusion of faith will steadily spread powerfully, and paired with religious hatred against Christianity and Judaism. This religious hatred will also be stirred up in the Orient, and will find many followers, starting from a maliciously minded, and power-seeking and criminalized religious fanatic who will rise to caliph. Through his fanatical deceit, his lies and his hatred of Judaism and Christianity, he will spread a new degenerate faith, which will be completely overgrown with bestial bloodshed, torture, rape, murder, and massacre, and the destruction of historical and inhabited sites. Thus a new and completely degenerating Islamism will emerge, and a murderous terrorist army, to which also many Christian believers, and also Jewish believers as well as extremely degenerate people from Europe, Asia, whole Arabia, the USA and Africa will join and accept the Islam faith. But it will also come to pass that many adventurous young people and adults of both sexes, coming from Europe, will commit themselves to this terrorist army, and convert to the degenerated Islamism. And this will happen on the one hand, because they want to break out of society, on the other hand, because they will be seduced to a confused belief in Islam by the words of Islamic preachers, who will be full of hatred against Christianity and Judaism, and against all cultures foreign to Islam. For many of the young, adults and adventurers, as well as for many other misguided people, joining the terrorist army will mean death, but this will not be considered by the faith fanatics, because they will all lack intelligence, which is why neither intellect nor reason will be sufficiently developed. Furthermore, in the future it will result that in all countries the masses of people of the inexorably increasing world population will change in their mentality, and thus also in their attitudes, demands, and behaviors etc. in a frightening mentally disillusioning way, and will fall into disenchantment and lack of feeling to their peers, to planet Earth, to nature and to all its forms of life. Diverse hatred will spread among people as well as feuds, revenge and retaliation, greed, human trafficking, fornication, commercial sex trade, sexual degeneration by religious representatives of both sexes, sexual child abuse, religious murder, religious hate murder and the murder of families, children, victims of robbery, rape, etc. And the killing of men and animals by arbitrary acts of violence out of pure pleasure in pleasure, will also expand in the coming times, as will the delusion regarding the practice of the death penalty for everything and everyone, whereby for this purpose even completely natural values are to be included. The future will bring unpleasant changes of mentality for the great mass of mankind, because already in the coming years many things will begin to change in the United States of America, which will however also quickly spread to Europe. Among adolescents and adults, a new trend is already developing, leading to a subculture, and becoming known as the lifestyle of hipsters, and consisting in adolescents and young adults beginning to dress strikingly and extravagantly, in order to distinguish themselves from the average population. This will be maintained over the next decade, from which a further and new subculture will be formed by young people and young adults in the middle of the decade after next. This subculture will spread for 6 years as announcers and flower children, and will be marked by open love, peace and freedom. Slowly fading after 6 years, this movement will dissolve again, and after another decade will merge with and influence new alternative scenes. The main new direction will be to protest against the new constant incitement by the US to incite a lurking threat of war against the Soviet Union over the next 40 years. This is because the USA want to stage a war after their traditional striving for world domination, in order to defeat the USSR, and bring it under their rule. But this will be counteracted mainly by protests from young people and young adults, which will lead to a music protest aimed at completely new harmonious popular music or light music of different styles and mass media dissemination, such as pop songs, musicals and folklore, etc. And this musical protest will have a calming effect on the entire world population, and will prevent the war rush of the USA's leaders from coming into play, as well as the Soviet Union's rulers from letting themselves be seduced by the USA's will and will. The fact that the future will bring unpleasant changes of mentality for the great masses of humanity will result despite the protests and protest music of young people and young adults. The pious driving force, which for several thousand years has been working insidiously against truth, peace and love, and which causes falsehood, hatred, rage, wars and every kind of disaster in men, is already pushing ahead in a strengthening way, and will trigger the change of attitude, which will degenerate every future disaster, and make it a danger to the community. The great outbreak will take place in 3.5 decades through hypocritical pus, and adoring delusion and cat-friendliness in loathsome repulsiveness, dishonesty, shrewdness, falsehood, and deception. It will be the time at which the malignant energies and powers will once again have an unholy effect on men, and their majority will become so addicted to all that is come of, miserable, degenerate and reprehensible as never before. The admonishing protests and the harmonic protest music of the youth and young adults will lose their strength after the beginning of the 1980s and quickly give way to disharmonic noise, which will sound badly together, and will strike people into a bondage full of disharmony without them being able to recognize and understand it. The new dissonances will cause a state of disharmony and more discord in people and constantly unleash new calamities, which, what is already beginning to develop today, will result from the stringing together of the excessively and irresponsibly growing world population. Their degenerating machinations will increasingly have destructive and exterminating consequences on the earth itself, and its nature, and with regard to all genera, species and subspecies in all habitats. Inexorable disputes, tensions, differences of all kinds, controversies, duels, feuds, polemics, enmities, disagreements, oppositions, ambivalence, discord, and dissension are caused, and thereby ever larger cracks and fissures between people and states. And these degenerations will be encouraged well into the new millennium by opportunistic machinations for government power strivers. They will seek to win the favor of the masses, and thus government offices through elections through allegedly popular, but generally demagogic political actors who dramatize the political situation and through lies, deception and empty promises. The increasing and newly effective devotional energies and forces will deform people differently in their mentality and shape them, so resistant to reason, and reason that they can no longer be accessible to any harmony. Thus the majority of people will become wild in their thoughts and feelings, and will fall away from the striving for peace and freedom as well as from justice, humanity and the unifying relationship with their peers. The consequences will be indifference and moral decay, as well as very rapidly spreading egoism, with evil selfishness, vice, addictions, and greed for material wealth, fornication, domination, and moral depravity, and complete irresponsibility in every sense, spreading throughout most of human society. A relationshiplessness that has existed for a long time, and also today, and will continue in the future in the interpersonal sphere as well as to nature and its life of every kind will degenerate to such an extent, that in the future a widespread disease will develop from it, and spread far and wide. In the coming decades, everything will expand to such an extent that it will lead to personal inner isolation and severe depressionism for many people. Especially in the industrialized countries this will degenerate, and demand a steadily increasing number of suicides. Depression will develop into a widespread and serious epidemic in many countries, which will be associated with a great deal of suffering on the part of those affected, and will also lead to many suicides among children and adolescents. This serious illness in the emotional breath of life, that is psyche, will become inexorably prevalent, especially from the beginning of the 1980s, to an alarming degree, but will be hushed up in society as a taboo. The causes for the emergence of this depression addiction will be manifold, such as harassment by other people, emerging unemployment, lack of relaxation, fears, religious delusion and inner emptiness, numbness, lack of interest or joy, constriction, discord, war experiences as well as lack of activity and lack of drive or fatigue, and many other driving forces, which lead to unbearable burden, will become dangerous overload and illness in the emotional life breath.
May 2019, the psyche is referred to as soul due to religious believing aberrance and esoteric nonsense, and is therefore described as such extremely misleadingly as the so-called superior part of the human mind, which, during the limited duration of human life, exercises superior mental programs, decisions, and intentions that would affect being human. These programs, it is nonsensically misconstrued, could not be changed by the limited ego consciousness of the living human being, because otherwise their fulfillment would be endangered. Esotericism also claims that programs and memories that are supposed to be in the aura or directly in the body do not belong to the soul itself, and therefore, when life is ended, they would be taken into the next life.
The meaning of these soul programs is supposed to prevent, so is misleadingly asserted by esotericism, contrary to all naturalness and creative correctness, that man, who according to esoteric meaning reincarnates again and again, in the course of his many reincarnations is supposed to lose himself in the swamp of his experiences, following which he no longer finds his way back. According to esoteric delusions, This means that the soul itself must see to it that the esoterically conceived limiting programs of man, which are supposed to embody his ego, do not become too big. As a result, esotericism misconstrues in a fanciful way that the soul has the task of limiting man's limiting programs all the more. For this purpose, esotericism makes use of alleged messages with which certain levels of increase are also supposedly to be enforced. The whole thing is presented as if it were a game, in which being a human being should be so perfectly conceived that he runs the risk of taking everything as reality, even in today's world, where quantum physics shows that there is no real solid matter. So man is subject only to the illusion of living in a real world. The soul, so esoterically confused it is claimed, ultimately consists of a kind of protection program which would draw man again and again in the direction of divine omnipotence, and towards absolute wholeness, harmony, salvation and happiness. Through esotericism, as through every other religious and sectarian delusion, on the one hand the real reality and its truth is disregarded and denied, and on the other hand every form of belief results in misinterpretations, false doctrines, lies, fantasies, delusions, and misunderstandings regarding the effective reality. Thus it is also not recognized, and not understood, that the mind corresponds to a pure creative energy that animates the consciousness and the entire body, that neither embodies the psyche nor in any way the mind, nor the reason and intelligence, and therefore it is also not responsible as a factor for any ideas, spirit flashes, for a awake mind etc., and also cannot be defined as part of a non-existent soul. For ideas, spirit flashes, mind, reason and intelligence the completely neutral mind is not responsible, which corresponds to a pure consciousness invigorating creative life and animation energy, whereby the consciousness is able to create negative or positive ideas and many other thought values through the function of thinking and thoughts. So the value of an idea, imagination or a so-called spirit flash etc. does not originate from the mind, which only has a creatively conditioned energy and power supply or an animation function for the consciousness and the physical body. In truth, every idea, and thought and spirit flash etc. corresponds solely to a work of consciousness, which thus does not originate from the neutral mind or its function, which is given solely as an enlivening energy. However, this fact is not of interest for esotericism, nor for any religious belief or other sectarianism. But what any religious delusion tries to explain as soul corresponds in truth to the psyche factor, which is formed by the thoughts and the resulting feelings. If the psyche falls into bad and disadvantageous motion, then this happens by corresponding thought and feeling disturbances, which cause structural changes in the cells and tissues responsible for it. This has the consequence, according to its nature, that if the psyche is negatively influenced by thoughts and feelings, they fall into a movement, when they are brought into turmoil. In the coming decades, and well into the next millennium, human life will generally be regarded as less and less valuable, driven by the devout energies and forces, because in the future humanity will experience not only a rise in crime, but in a frightening way also serious violent crimes such as murder, robbery, and homicide, assault, and robbery, whereby people will cry out for the death penalty and their otherwise already weak minds and their lack of reason and responsibility. Everything will be repeated constantly in ever shorter times, because all these actions and deeds will incite many men to repeat the same crimes, whereby everything will also lead more and more brutally, and to the dulling of thoughts and feelings, and will become ever more degenerate. The accumulation of serious violent crimes directed against life and limb is often triggered by hatred, faith, jealousy, greed, existential anxiety, depression, domination, loss, harassment, intrigue and greed, etc., as well as by the atrocities and massacres that will shake world affairs in wars and terrorism. Passions will continue to play an important role, but in the future people will be more and more dominated by greed for money and materialism, and will therefore become lawbreakers, whose highest aspiration will only be the naked craving for profit, for which they will also include murderous violence, and, as an old earthly proverb expresses it, walking corpses. So the impetuous striving for profit without effort and work will be on the one hand what leads man to crime, on the other hand also, to contempt of human life, and he will kill and destroy it without hesitation, if an adversary stands in his way. Every profound reverence for life has been dwindling for centuries, and will be lost more and more, although it should be the fundamental foundation of a genuine humane and precious culture. Instead of reverence, the majority of humanity will face a crisis of authority, which will result in a nefarious egoistic selfishness and lack of life orientation, as well as a profound poisoning of human-to-human relationships, undermining any true community. Instead of reverence, and this is how the future will be worse than it has been for some time and still is, people will no longer think about honor and dignity, but more than ever about the fact that these values are superfluous and nonsensical. And so it will become very special in the area of dealing with fellow human beings, as well as in the area of nature and everything that thrives, and creeps and flies in it. And this is already being done by the parents or other responsible educators in the upbringing of the growing generations, namely by showing them honorlessness and dignity. Thus, instead of reverence, to the contrary, contempt, hypocrisy, disdain, arrogance, and disrespect. This will do this, and more in the future, which will bring children, adolescents, and older adolescents a considerable reduction in the development of their intellect and their reason even at a young age, but which will also increasingly lead to a deplorable lack of development and expansion of their intelligence in the future. As a result, the longer and longer children and adolescents will no longer look for higher values, nor will they be offered any opportunity to convey these values to them. On the contrary, all over the world everything is still done to abuse children and young people politically and religiously, and to drive them into a delusion of faith of a religion or sect, be it concerning Buddhism or concerning Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity, or the various sects. All religious and cult preachers of all religions and sects, as well as parents and other educators, are already indoctrinating the children and young people in their prayer houses, be they temples, synagogues, mosques, madrasas, ashrams or churches, etc. Other buildings and institutions will also be used for this purpose. For instance, in the Christian world, not only the church, but also the general education schools, as well as children's and youth homes, and Christian vocational training institutions, etc. In the time to come, a particularly degenerating materialistic society will be taught, especially at such Christian-led places, which on the one hand is aimed at begging for the enrichment of the churches, on the other hand however at a new and intensive trapping of faith, because in Christianity, contrary to Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, and Hinduism, the number of believers already today shows a decreasing tendency, which in the course of the coming decades, and in the new millennium, will still strengthen. Therefore already today, and in the coming decades as well as in the third millennium, in increasing measure work will be done to indoctrinate learning Christian believers, who are regarded as suitable, manipulatively in their faith imagination, that they are called to the spreading of the Christian faith. In this way they will be pretended to have a vocation role which God has intended for them, combined with a spiritual and ethical leadership role to which they should be called according to divine will, but of which they will not be aware, and can never become aware, because it will only be an indoctrinated lie as it has been used since time immemorial. And in order for this doctrine of lies to begin to take hold properly, reference will be made to the epoch of serious crime, which emerged decades ago in the USA, and is now, and will continue to do so, as well as to the increasing prevalence of violent crime. The beneficial criminal element of these organizations will gain unheard of material values and enjoy them through murders, bribes and their own government activities, without being able to be prosecuted for their crimes. This, like any other prediction, is intended to reveal that many of the rulers of the peoples of all countries are creating unjustly acquired wealth, while the honestly working peoples will enjoy little prosperity. This prediction is meant to be a warning signal, because it is meant to awaken the peoples and to show them that the majority of all leading circles of all governments, the economy and administrations as well as corporations etc. financially exclude and harm the peoples in every possible way, which is why all peoples are to be called to self-contemplation. Many wars, terror, destruction and annihilation will mark the future, with thousands of deaths and hundreds of thousands of people murdered, while all the laws of nature will be forced out of order by the guilt of the enormously increasing overpopulation. A great deal will be destroyed, and irreparably destroyed on the planet and in nature, and the atmosphere and climate will also be affected to such an extent that the whole of nature will rise up and have disastrous catastrophic effects. Thunderstorms as in the early days of the earth will increase due to the guilt of man, and hailstorms, storms, rain floods and tremendous floods will become more and more violent, but also the planetary sun protection layer, that is ozone layer, will be very dangerously damaged, and inhuman skin ulcers, that is skin cancer, will trigger. Also the eternal frost, that is permafrost, will dissolve and release dangerous frozen toxic gases, that is methane, as well as the mountains fall down, and avalanches will be triggered. Also the lungs of the earth, the forests necessary for all life, are irresponsibly cut down, and the wood is misused as need materials in the ground for the construction of houses of the world's increasing population. More and more earthquakes and seaquakes and primeval storms will increase in their number more and more, and will bring more powerful and destructive effects, the origin of which will be an unnatural change of the climate, caused by the machinations of the ever more precarious increasing world population, which has already exceeded the bearable measure of the earth far today, but will nevertheless be unreasonably and unstoppably pushed up. Only the immeasurable masses of citizen villages, which by their weight, will affect the inner structures of the earth, will affect the tectonics more and more and inevitably cause more and more interterrestrial shifts and distortions and thus earthquakes, which will also have influences on the whole earthly volcanism, because the volcanoes are connected with each other worldwide by the vibration oscillations, and will therefore become active connecting. The constantly growing overpopulation will already have 9 billion people in the first 2 decades of the new millennium, and thus cause many enormous and unsolvable problems, because through the stupidity and ignorance of the entire humanity, with few exceptions, the reality is not recognized, that the whole evil lies in the growth of the world population and nothing is done against it. But through stupidity only completely absurd false solutions are sought, and absurd decisions are made, instead of recognizing the truth, which will lie in the growing world population, which should be stopped. And before the end of this century, the overcrowding of the world's population will result in an increase in traditional famines in several ways, as well as the recurrence of old diseases believed to have been eradicated, and new diseases and epidemics that will spread as a result of mass tourism emerging worldwide. Otherwise, the industrialized countries will be flooded with economic refugees and asylum seekers, mainly from the African continent, making everything an insoluble problem. And this will also be the case when refugees from war-torn countries in the Middle East, and from an Islamic terrorist organization, that is Islamist equals Islamist state, will break into Europe, including many criminals, violent criminals and terrorists. In the 1980s, the global economic boom will collapse and bring global unemployment, which will last for many decades well into the new millennium, and consequently many unemployed and shy of work will become victims of crime and violent crime, which will particularly affect the industrialized countries. Television, computers and an emerging and almost limitless digitalization will become the most important information and commercial media, making people very quickly dominant and absolutely dependent on them. One result of this new technology will be that many marriages, families, friendships, and acquaintances will be destroyed. The health of countless people will be affected and the peoples will be completely monitored, controlled, and deprived of their personal freedom by the governments and their secret services. This is also due to the drug trafficking which is taking place in the United States, because there is already a great deal of drug addiction there today, especially among young people who, however, will begin to lead a life towards the end of the next decade which will correspond to a countercultural youth movement, which will then moderate everything malicious in the world, as I said earlier. That is hippie movement. Hippie equals English hip announced. Core of the hippie period was 1965 to 1971. However, for some time now, drugs have also been spread worldwide by criminal organizations from the USA, and, even before the 1980s, they have led to a drug problem in Europe, which will become so prevalent in Europe as well, as in the form of epidemics, pleasure seeking, prostitution, mass tourism and so on. Everything will degenerate, especially when the harmonic protest music of the youth and early adults as well as the older people who emulate them musically is replaced by demonic and destructive discording noises and nonsensical fictitious singing, whereby the factor of emotional life is mentally disastrously impaired and the behavior of the people is aligned accordingly. The earthly world events of the near and distant future will be marked until well into the third millennium by many hundreds of wars and malicious terror, for which degenerate and irresponsible element will be responsible. And these subjects will be powerful statesmen, dictators, the world domination addicted United States of America, bloodthirsty tyrants as well as religiously delusion-stricken religionists and their fanatical believers, but also murderous criminal organizations, all sorts of emerging leaders and their followers of political parties. But there will also be those who hate religion, xenophobia, and revolt, as well as many other malicious elements, which in future will increasingly fuel wars, terror, crime, murder and other crimes as well as discord, insecurity, hatred, and violence. And all this will result in ever-increasing and multiplying forms and masses that will become worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, with an uncontrolled proliferation of poisonous insects. But with regard to what has been said in connection with the very fast-growing and soon overgrowing world population, due to their unstoppable increase, more and more degenerating machinations will arise in the coming times, by which on the one hand the earth itself, and on the other hand its nature with all forms of life, with all that creeps, flies, swims and is bound to location, severely impaired, endangered and often irrevocably destroyed, and completely destroyed and exterminated. Also the destruction of natural stone, which corresponds however to a heavy metal, is to be led in this regard, because it will continue to be abused in the coming decades far into the next millennium, and will bring large calamity, as it has already been used criminally, and destroyed by a dangerous rift to cause even more immense further destruction, killing hundreds of thousands of unsuspecting, harmless and peaceful people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in seconds in August 1945. So will the destruction of natural rock continue. Driven by fear of war and cowardice, the great states will very quickly emulate the criminal research of the United States, and construct and store masses of atomic bombs, to promote mutual threats and the danger of nuclear catastrophe, that would tear the planet to pieces and wipe out humanity. And this danger will persist far into the next millennium, namely through the fact that through the damaging research mania of the unpredictable scientists, the natural rock will continue to find abusive uses, and will be used in various ways. In addition to the mass production of nuclear bombs and missiles, which has already begun, other transportable and portable weapons with nuclear warheads, or with nuclear emitting projectiles etc. will also be constructed and used. Further, however, the natural rock uranium heavy metal will also be used to produce energy in great power, which will find many uses, such as in medicine, as well as for drives of vehicles, ships, and machines, etc. But this energy production will be very dangerous from the ground up, and will lead to great horrors and the deaths of many people. However, neither the scientific researchers nor the heads of state, rulers, politicians, the military and the terror organizations and criminal organizations that are emerging worldwide will give any thought to this, and will not recognize the imminent dangers. They will all act rashly, thoughtlessly, and irresponsibly, as was the case with the exploration of natural rock and the construction of the atomic bomb and its criminal use. So it will be that the further development of nuclear research will cause catastrophes and have terrible consequences, which will then prove to be very long-lasting and over many decades affecting disaster. And this will be because the natural rock uranium through the splitting and processing etc. will release atomic radiation for the production of atomic energy, which has a destructive effect on all living things, and through which innumerable men will be contaminated, terribly wasting away, and dying from what already happens at the present time, about which those responsible for the whole however have not yet gained any noteworthy knowledge. So they do not yet have any essential knowledge about the fact that all areas are extensively contaminated by nuclear radiation, in which underground and above ground nuclear explosions were carried out, which has the consequence that all persons who enter these areas even briefly, or stay there for a longer time, will suffer from radiation sickness and cancer for years, and will finally die from the radiation suffered and its consequences. But this will also happen in other ways, because plans are already being devised, and research is being carried out underground to generate energy, in order to use the natural rock uranium as a primary energy source on a large scale, from which nuclear power plants will be devised, constructed and in many countries, built in the foreseeable future. But also this technology will claim many human lives, cause nuclear disasters, and contaminate large areas with nuclear radiation for a very long time, which will remain a health and fatal danger for all life. In the future, criminality and crime will become more and more degenerate, and corresponding groups will also contribute to this, forming gangs, forming a subculture, and whose members will mostly be street bandits. These will harass passers-by, rob businesses, murder, be violent, engage in human trafficking, and forced prostitution, and appear as motorcycle clan supporters, mostly dressed in black, and organize themselves in motorcycle clubs. They will, however, have criminal backgrounds and accordingly have aggressive and violent behaviors and tendencies, and be permanent unteachable lawbreakers. Repeatedly the same facts must be pointed out again and again, because only through repetitions one learns. Therefore also the earthly world events must be addressed again and again, which will be marked in the future by many aspects regarding wars, crimes against humanity, and organized terror by state powerful as well as by non-governmental terror organizations. In many countries, through the stupidity, lack of initiative and religious faith of the peoples, violent and unscrupulous criminal element will rise up as powerful statesmen, oppress and exploit their peoples, and allow all their opponents to be assassinated without being called to account. Through this many peoples are put into fear and terror, especially also because always a part of the peoples is in its stupidity and unneediness to the rulers to will, because profit and advantages are hoped for thereby. It must also be repeatedly pointed out that the earth, its nature and the whole of humanity are plunged by their own guilt into immense natural disasters, and thus into misery and distress, as well as by acts of war and a worldwide terrorism that is unparalleled in the Middle East and in the Near East. As the main cause of all acts of war and terror, the United States of America will, as always, be in the first place, and will continue to interfere in the interests of foreign states with its criminal secret services, and with armed force and armies around the world, striving for world domination and without justification. Secret service actions in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as in the Near East and Central Asia, are already being secretly initiated, which in the course of the next decades will lead to open interferences and conflicts with military operations and acts of war, and this into the new millennium. The USA will do everything in its power to maintain its traditional sly world domination aspirations, and consequently will infiltrate Middle Eastern countries with its aspirations for domination. In particular, they will be Arab states whose leaders, because of their stupidity and naivety, will be sneakily forced into the new millennium in the course of the next decades, to engage in the insidious seductions, intrigues, and machinations of the USA, and thereby become its dependent vassal states. It is done by detailed obligations of the religiously believing and corrupt state leaders in the Middle East, who will arm themselves militarily in order to be able to spread and exercise their power in the Middle East with the help of the USA, but without admonishing that they will get into difficulties by their actions with the United States itself, which insidiously also provoke hatred and discord in whole Arabia. And they will do this particularly well through their secret services and politics as a result of the traditional religious enmity between the strictly Islamist Shiites and Sunnis, who have always fought each other to the point of murder and war, and by the pitfalls of the American secret services and politics. In the coming times these religious feuds are continued, and constantly anew incited, like also the internal discord in the individual Arab states themselves, like everywhere on earth in all countries, with only very few exceptions, which are controlled by irresponsible power possessed, and their peoples oppressing autocrats, dictators and tyrants. Although some of these Arab peoples will begin to think and stand up against their blood rulers in a few decades' time, everything will quickly return to the old way, because no real leaders will emerge from the peoples, or because the military forces will seize power, as elsewhere on earth in countries on all continents. But what will result in the future in whole Arabia by the interferences and secret service actions of the USA, will bring serious consequences for the entire Near East, and for Near East. So it will be that on the one hand, in addition to the dependency of the Arab countries, they will inevitably also become vassals of the US government, the US military and the US secret services, whereby their fanatical religious beliefs will continue to lead to bloody feuds, and the murder of their own family members, and cause much harm. This, while on the other hand, as a result of the insidiousness that will be practiced by the USA in the coming times in Arabia, terror organizations on a grand scale will emerge, and become active worldwide with murders, assassinations, and destruction, right up to war crimes of terror. The real perpetrators of this emerging terrorism will be the United States, because, as has always been the case, willing people from various countries will continue to receive military and guerrilla training in America, only to become insidious in their own homelands, incite the peoples, and make them friendly to America. In many cases, however, since time immemorial it has been the case, and will continue to be in the future, that the educated will later rise up as power-hungry leaders, and take revenge in a blood-hungry manner. And so it will also be in the future, whereby however everything will become much more ill-fated than ever before, because through the whole technical development of every kind as well as the machinations and intriguing help of the USA everything necessary for it will be created. And that the corrupt rulers will also contribute everything imaginable to this. This will indeed be the case, because they will demand arms supplies from the USA, which they consider friends in their stupidity and naivety, and conclude trade agreements with the United States of America, which will enter into them, but in the insidious way, that the Arab states concerned, and their rulers will be bound to the USA for better or for worse. In the same way, the United States will deal with other rulers and states around the world, also in terms of international interdependence, that is globalization, which has existed, and is customary since time immemorial, but which will become very important in the future, but which will result in much damage, disadvantage, and sinister things. In the course of time, and well into the new millennium, this will affect all states and their peoples, as well as all areas of the environment, politics, religions, economy, communication, technology, and culture, etc. In particular, international interdependencies will be so maliciously manipulated by the USA's compelling influences, that they will be, and remain, the big profiteers, as they have always been. It will be these great profiteers who, through their worldwide intrigues and insidiousness and malicious manipulations, will create a world unrest like never before. However, the future and hidden great dangers, which emanate from the USA, and which will conceal death, destruction, and ruin, and which will be extremely dangerous in their unpredictability, will not become recognizable to the USA friendly and good-minded, but also to dependent countries, their government leaders and the stupid and unneedy from the populations. In the end it will become impossible to still be able to control the criminal political secret service and world domination addicted as well as economic machinations of the USA. Consequently everything will degenerate more and more, and assume such catastrophic forms as these have never before been triggered by men, since the existence of the earth. As a result of the blindness and stupidity of all those state leaders who are turning the USA to account, and those who are cheering the USA up from the populations in all countries around the world, they will all fail to recognize what the world domination addicted, treacherous, sophisticated, cunning, incapable of leading a state and causing conflict, as well as the enormous financial debt of the USA's domination addicts, are basically planning, intending and having in mind all these state leaders, who, like all their predecessors, are great and educated as leaders, but in truth, are just as incapable of any people's leadership and people's financial leadership, and consequently will drive their states into enormous horrendous debts, will, as in the past, also in the future, engage with the USA, thereby causing damage in their own countries and also worldwide, spreading discord, harassing their own populations, and bringing death and destruction upon them. And the USA also contributes to this in another way, because in the future also machinations of the USA will be hatched, through which guerrilla trainings for the most modern use of weapons and combat trainings for foreign element will be carried out, which on the one hand betray their own homelands, but after the training also the USA, and will go off against them. The USA and its state leaders, politicians, secret service agents and all those who agree with them in their offices, whatever that part of the population belongs to who, as since time immemorial, believes and agrees without hesitation to the treacherous political, governmental, secret service and military machinations and stupidity, blindness, and incapacity to think with a cry of pro and cheer, correspond to miserable element, which, as in other countries as a rule, should never be appointed to the offices assigned to them. And as far as that part of the USA population is concerned who is devoted to righteousness, peace, justice and humanity, then, as already since the existence of the USA, it is pushed aside, and given no possibility of intervention, against which it cannot, however, defend itself. Because if it did this, then all its rights would be taken away from it, freedom and security would be lost, and brought into the mills of the laws, as well as the strange handling of laws, punished or murdered. But this has its origin already before the time when the USA was founded, for which inevitably some is to be explained and explained. If in the USA the presidencies are considered in particular, especially in relation to the entire USA, then the fact corresponds to the fact that up to now not a single president has held the office of president in righteousness. This is also the case at present, and will continue to be the case well into the new millennium. George Washington, the first president of the United States of America, to hold the presidency from 1789 to 1797, was already a murderer, war criminal and traitor. And the fact that the First World War of 1756-1763 was triggered, wrongly referred to as the 7 Years' War, was in fact traced back to years of underhand intrigues by immigrant Europeans who could be described as early Americans, and who fomented unrest until the war was triggered, 20 years before the United States of America was founded on the 4th of July 1776. Through the intrigues and agitations of the early Americans, who wanted to have their own state, and therefore caused discord among the English and French, who were still in America at that time, the war developed in the course of the years. The dispute between Great Britain and the American colonies led through the intrigues and agitation of the early Americans to the War of 1756-1763, later to the American Revolution, whereby in 1776 delegates of the 13 colonies adopted the Declaration of Independence of the United States and proclaimed the foundation of the United States of America. What was recorded in all the records and chronicles of the time in which the actual truth of all the events occurred, was subsequently erased and destroyed after the founding of the United States of America in order not to bring the new America into disrepute as an incitement to war and a trigger for war. This will also happen in the USA in the future, either by those responsible themselves, or on their behalf by helpers. Files, records, chronicles, plans, and images, etc., will be destroyed in the US until the distant future, if they could be used as evidence of past and present facts, events and real facts, lies, fraud and conspiracies. The fact that such more or less serious evidence was destroyed, and will continue to be destroyed well into the future, should on the one hand guarantee state security, and on the other hand prevent large-scale lies and fraud by the government, politics, the army, secret services, certain corporations, organizations and state military construction centers, etc., as well as other state machinations from becoming public. Therefore, this criminal activity is not simply tolerated, but is considered unscrupulously and consciously as an act of integrity and protection of the honor and dignity of the USA and all its machinations as an unwritten law for the preservation of the false integrity, honor, and dignity of the USA. The extent to which this dubious honor, dignity, and integrity of the USA will be effective in the future, and well into the third millennium, can be seen from all the foresights that reveal the evil, the terrible and the extremely disastrous. More and more, faster and more vehemently, the USA will interfere politically, militarily, and secretly in foreign countries, and settle down in them. In particular, the various secret services currently in preparation will play a particularly criminal role, above all the US Secret Service, which will be established next September under the name Central Intelligence Agency as the Foreign Secret Service of the United States of America, and will then be responsible for acts of war and revolution and many other violent crimes around the world well into the third millennium. And all this will happen in order to smuggle the United States of America all over the world into other states and thereby win more and more world domination. In the process, innumerable murders and other violent crimes are committed by the American Secret Services and Army, and always within the framework of the US delusion of being able to rule all states, and thus the world alone. The United States of America took its first steps as early as 1941, and maintained them over the following years, only to assert its demands regarding its interests and ideas in the penultimate year, that is 1945, at the forefront of the UN Founding Conference. The USA rose to become the strongest world power, with Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the USA, and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreeing as early as 1941 to adhere to common principles in an Atlantic Charter, which was laid down in writing as principles for the maintenance of peace and security. Everything, however, was only appearance and deception, because the USA did not abide by it, but since then have continued their intrigues in foreign countries, which they continue to do unchecked, and will continue in the third millennium. Through all this and much more, the United States of America is, and remains the greatest threat to peace, freedom, and justice in all countries, and for all peoples throughout the world. The USA did this well, because in December 1941 they had entered the last World War, but this had only happened through the long, constant and urgent efforts of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. By the entry of the USA into the Third World War, then also the victory succeeded in April/May 1945 over Nazi Germany, and then in August 1945 over Japan. The criminal destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by atomic bombs and the murder of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, who had nothing to do with the World War, were simply swept under the carpet all over the world. With the development of the atomic bomb alone, the USA committed the greatest war crime and humanity crime ever committed in the history of mankind, which is many times more comprehensive than all Nazi crimes and all wars and terrorist acts of all time put together. The danger of nuclear war, however, will spread into the third millennium and the distant future, and everything will expand even more dangerously as knowledge and techniques advance, as the knowledge gained so far is developed further, and leads to even more dangerous developments, ultimately fusing nuclear energy. This means that the atomic energies and forces merge and unite with each other, whereby the intensity of the force or its pronounced existing measure is increased many times over. In this regard, however, these are physical moments about which you have not yet been instructed, which is why I will instruct you later in further explanations, so that you will understand everything that will be unusual, and contain information that you are never allowed to announce. However, with regard to your age, the knowledge of the entire context of atomic fusion encompasses another form of energy, which is often more powerful, and, if misused, releases forces many thousands of times greater than those of atomic fusion, which could completely destroy and atomize not only planet Earth, but the entire Sol system and beyond. So you have to be responsible as you are to keep silence for life, because for a very long time the Earth people will continue to misuse any knowledge for the production of weapons and the exercise of power, far away from any responsibility. But that will also be in the future with the further development of nuclear technology and also the atomic bomb, whereby on the one hand in the course of the time various states will become addicted to a mania, rising in them to also become an atomic power. On the other hand, however, very early on, and thus already today, the Swiss government officials and various physicists are considering, and without the knowledge of the people, the development of formulas for atomic bombs. Secretly, possibilities are already being considered, and secret first plans for nuclear tests are being worked out, which are to be carried out in the Gotthard Massif, if the delusions of those responsible for the state and the physicists involved were to prevail. But this will not be as future looks can be seen. In the future, foresight will show that worldwide the vast majority of state officials and their dogs will continue to be irresponsible element, and will seek to maintain their power in every possible way, and extend it to other countries, with the United States of America remaining at the forefront. But they will also help tyrants around the world, because they will be the ones who will believe that they can have a selfish and deceitful friendship with the USA, but they will not suspect that they themselves will be deceived. And they will be the ones who will be exploited, deceived, and flooded with arms supplies in the coming times well into the third millennium by the world's largest arms producers and suppliers, the United States of America, in their favor, but only with such products which are already outdated, and will not correspond to the latest and better as well as often kept secret arms developments. Nevertheless, the state authorities, their lackeys and large sections of the population will fall to their knees in front of the USA as a result of their stupidity and ignorance regarding the machinations of the USA and let them spread out in their country, control and live much, until they finally take total control of the whole country. This will happen mainly in the Middle East, as well as in the Far East and South America, but also in Germany, and later in Eurasia. Contrary to this, however, a Europe-wide dictatorship will arise in Europe, some of which will be dominated until the third millennium by the occupying power of the USA, especially Germany, which, as a union dictatorship, will dominate all European states from Brussels. And it will be to the detriment of Switzerland, because of the stupidity, unreasonableness, and lack of intelligence as well as the incapacity of certain state leaders, their followers and that part of the people who will be uneducated, and also stupid and incapable with regard to a logical incapacity to judge, that mergers will take place with the Union dictatorship, as a result of which your homeland will fall more under its thumb. Despite all the war crimes and human crimes of the United States of America, they nevertheless joined the UN membership through their far-reaching demands, so that in the future they will also be able to realize their world domination plans and challenged in other ways in many other states through their military. As a result, the USA is, and will continue to be the largest possible and worst possible factor in the future for many more new and hundreds of acts of war in the coming decades well into the third millennium. So the United States of America, through its largest and most comprehensive secret service, and its military forces expanding and operating throughout the world, will be responsible for unrest throughout the world, insurrections, revolutions, treacherous political and secret service murders, as well as acts of terrorism of all kinds, which will also imitate private groups and political and religious fanatic organizations around the world, as well as dictators. As a result, previously peaceful states suddenly turn back into dictatorships of power-hungry and dishonest as well as treacherous element, who present themselves lyingly and deceivingly as good and pious state leaders, etc., and allow themselves to be celebrated by stupid supporters. However, they will all pursue interests harmful to the population and the state, and thus cause much damage, unrest, and disaster, as well as create unrest, but also create bondage and terror, as will happen early in the next millennium in Germany, France and in various other Union dictatorship vassal states. The United States of America itself is also driven to acts of terrorism and war by confused and incapable element that reach the supreme power of the state. And through these pathologically stupid, self-opinionated, and insane power-obsessed American presidents, new enmities will arise between the USA and other states. This will be, for example, as it has been since time immemorial with regard to the Soviet Union and Russia, which will emerge again in about 4 decades, but also with regard to states such as China, Persia, and Arab states, etc., as well as North Korea, which will now be proclaimed a state in 455 days, and will become a country of evil internal terror against the population. The same will happen all over the world. However, with the dictatorship state of Syria in particular coming into the interest of the USA, and being largely destroyed by a long-standing civil war, as well as historical sites, that will completely raze everything to the ground through a sectarian, maliciously degenerating and thousand-fold murdering Islamic terrorist organization, that is Islamist state. And just as the USA has been playing itself up as a world police force since time immemorial, and as a result has been able to interfere everywhere around the world in an autocratic and uninhibited manner, they will continue to do so. So it will be that in the new millennium towards the end of the second decade Persia will also another time be brought into distress, and harassed by the USA and its then unpredictable, domineering, stupid, unsteady and confused president. And this will also be the case in the future, because the peoples of the earth will do nothing about it, because of their incompetent leaderships, and on the other hand their leaders will be too cowardly to assert themselves against the USA. These are the emerging facts, so everything will remain as before, namely that the United States of America, under the leadership of its criminal, self-opinionated presidential leaders around the world, can and will continue to increasingly assert its world domination, self-opinionatedness, delusions of grandeur and forced influence. and this will also be the case in the new millennium, and in the third millennium, when another, self-opinionated and megalomaniac President of the United States of America feels himself to be a powerful leader. At that time he will be an unpredictable man who is subject to a pathological delusion of grandeur, who will become more and more recognizable as Adolf Hitler behaves, and who will become addicted to the delusion of being a great, invincible and unique ruler, a ruler of power before whom the entire world population must kneel and crawl in the dust. So he will behave just as threateningly as Hitler did in his day, but by doing so he will easily and foolishly force other powerful statesmen and peoples to resist. In particular, in the second decade of the new millennium, the states of Russia, North Korea, China and Persia in particular will be attacked not only verbally, but also by military threats, by this incapable of government and Hitler-like leader of the USA. And because military and warlike troops and battleships will be stationed outside the borders of the enemies at the same time, and stupid, criminal and imbecilic economic sanctions will be devised and enforced, everything will not only lead to a trade war, but also to threatening acts of war. And to this end, the sick and stupid supreme ruler of the USA, who is incapable of governing, or the President of the United States of America, that is Donald John Trump, together with all his like-minded people and his followers, will provoke a new great and far-reaching war, as well as a war that is very dangerous and much completely devastating, if all other states of the earth are still reasonable elements of the USA do nothing about it. It will become inevitable, however, that towards the end of the second decade in the third millennium the USA will also place all kinds of war equipment close to the borders of the enemy states concerned and conceived by the confused and megalomaniacal American president who is absolutely incapable of being in power. But this can then lead to very bad and nasty counter effects of the affected states by their military and populations, especially in Persia, China, Russia, and North Korea, from which very extensive acts of war can result again. This will prove to be particularly true in the Persian Gulf, where the United States will threaten to sail warships to force the Islamic sect leadership of Persians, who are despised by a malevolent delusion and despise the lives of their population, into a religious dictatorship, to fulfill the demands of the President of the United States, who is incapable of governing. But in connection with Persia I will have to explain a few things later, because in the course of your life in this country there will be a lot of importance for you as well. Terror, criminality and crime will also be conjured up by leaders, also in other countries, whereby the structures of all orders will be destroyed, as this will also be carried far into the future, as it will happen, for example, in the Republic of Turkey, which in the second decade of the third millennium will fall under the power of malicious, lying and deceitful presidential ruler, namely through an overthrow, which he himself will arrange, and thereby reach total power. And such political irregularities etc. will already happen in a few decades in Europe in the emerging Dictatorship Union, and in its states, as well as in the Near East, Eurasia, Africa, the Middle East and South America. This will already prove itself from next year, 1948, when the foundation of a new state will take place, which will be called Israel, and will thus become the beginning of hatred and expulsion, resulting in vicious fighting without end by the original inhabitants of Palestine, who will be expelled from their homeland. But also an Israeli and brutal army will emerge, which will mercilessly murder and destroy far into the third millennium, as will the descendants of the former inhabitants of the country. And as in the USA, also in the emerging Israel a secret service will emerge, which will commit crimes worldwide and will also like all secret services, cause fights, murders, and destruction. This emerging Israeli secret service will act worldwide maliciously and treacherously, just as it will also commit many inhuman acts, murder many researchers and scientists and dissolve their victims in acids, if they will not harmonize with various Israeli concepts, or if dangers for Israel or its powerful, the army or for the secret service itself are suspected by them. And as it must inevitably come, also the state Israel will bring itself by criminal connected, and Israel-friendly government element of the USA into the possession of all necessary documents and plans etc. for the development of atomic bombs. Israel will also remain for a very long time a bloody and terrorist hotbed of conflict between Judaism, Arabia and the neo-Nazi system, which is already being rebuilt by Nazi fanatics and haters of Jews in Germany, and will spread far and wide in the course of time, with particularly large Nazi groups emerging in the USA and the Soviet Union, which will later continue to exist in the new Russia. In the United States of America already the first president was a dishonorable man, like all other presidents who followed him, because all of them were not persons of integrity, but lust for war and world domination, as will remain the case in the future, and already at the beginning of the third millennium will lead to malicious acts of war in the Middle East, when USA presidents will live out their lust for war as father and son. And in a very short time it will come to pass that the military forces of the USA will spread all over the world and foreign countries. This in addition to the occupying military, which have been stationed since the end of the war in Europe and in other states. And as always, the USA will continue to create discord worldwide in its world domination conduct, and will also divide the Arab states, and thus cause enmities among them. But we should say enough about this now, because there is still a lot to be said about nature and all its living beings, but also about the inexorably growing world population, through which the planet, nature and all conceivable forms, genera and species of plants, and living beings are being destroyed, and exterminated more and more, as a result of which already in the third millennium the world will be a world in which the world will be a world in which the world will be a world in which all living creatures will be able to live. In the first millennium, early before the year 2020, around 1 million living creatures from the approximately 30 million different species of plant growths and independently moving living creatures that exist on Earth down to the tiniest microbes, which are more than 400 millionths of a millimeter in size, are slowly but surely being irrevocably exterminated by the machinations of the endlessly growing humanity on Earth. Animals, all sorts of creatures, amphibians, lizards, birds, all sorts of water beings, surreptitious beings and insects etc. are exterminated largely or totally in the coming decades and far into the third millennium inside. Forests will be cleared and moors etc. destroyed in all future times, in order to gain new planting land for the ever-increasing need for growing food crops, while on the other hand insanely fertile land will be used for residential houses, factories, and roads etc. and concreted. And all this only for the sake of the endless growth of mankind on Earth, which in their unreasonableness drive their birth rates into ever higher heights, and continue to set their offspring into the world in vast quantities without understanding, with which a dangerous overpopulation is created, through whose machinations nature, its plant world, manifold living beings of all kinds and species are destroyed, and many things are completely exterminated. The oxygen content is also affected in its consistency by various artificial, and also from the earth rising gases, as well as the atmosphere is impregnated by various toxins, the planetary sun protection layer is largely destroyed, and overall climatic disturbances and ultimately a global climate change, and from it a climate change will result, and afterwards a climate upheaval will take place. This will result in far-reaching changes in the living conditions for all earthly life as a whole, and in the end not only millions, but ultimately billions of people will lose their lives when enormous primeval catastrophes cast a spell over the entire earth and all life. In the coming decades, and further in the third millennium also old and exterminated, as well as new unknown epidemics are taken away innumerable human lives. However, these epidemics will not arise through the natural course of nature, but through the guilt of the earth people. And this will come about in the future as a result of the emerging and ever more widespread internationalization, and thus worldwide expansion and spread or mondialization, that is globalization. The reason for this is that the irresponsible and uncontrolled growth of the world's population has led to a huge increase in the transport of goods of all kinds around the world, ignoring all security measures. This will lead to dangerous pathogens and epidemics being spread all over the world by animals, insects and other living creatures of all kinds, resulting in diseases and epidemics that on the one hand mutate, and on the other hand originally only wreaked havoc in their countries of origin. This is how it will be that in 30 years a worldwide spreading immunodeficiency disease, that is AIDS, will spread, which originated already more than 30 years ago in Africa, when locals sexually joined up with chimpanzees, and became infected with a virus that brought death and destruction, and the resulting disease began to spread. This epidemic will spread creepingly throughout the world in the coming decades, especially in homosexual circles, but will not be recognized until 3 decades from now, when more and more epidemic victims will be recognized as such. So from now on epidemics and diseases etc. will spread as epidemics and pandemics all over the world. This means that a normal epidemic is localized, but under certain circumstances an endemic form or an endemic can develop. If this is the case, then a disease or plague will accumulate continuously in a particular population or limited region, with the disease or plague continuously increasing in comparison to other populations or regions over a longer period of time. On the one hand this results in a disease frequency, and on the other hand in a new disease frequency of the respective disease or epidemic. There is a great difference between disease and epidemic, but this fact is wrongly judged in the entire earthly medical doctrine, is not accepted, and, as a result of the narrow-mindedness of medical science, remains so for a long time into the third millennium. A disease usually corresponds to a single person's disease, while an epidemic is contagious, widespread and possibly fatal. The absolutely given difference between sickness and plague will therefore not be considered for a long time yet. Consequently the difference between sickness and plague resulting from the difference will neither be considered, nor accepted far into the third millennium. A disease is not an epidemic, but a state of reduced physical performance resulting from a disturbance in the normal functioning of an organ or part of the body, which can usually be regulated, controlled, and cured by medical means for a short period of time, if not chronically degenerated. This is the case when one or more organs are affected by one or more dysfunctions. However, such disorders can also affect the entire physical organism, as well as the psychological area. A disease thus corresponds to an abnormal state of body, mind or consciousness, that requires intentional medical treatment, and usually leads to a shorter or longer period of inability to work, but which will be resolved in the foreseeable future, and is not usually fatal. In contrast to the disease, the epidemic is a highly contagious malignant infectious disease, which has a dangerous effect, spreads rapidly and possibly leads to a disease of infancy. Since ancient times, epidemics have included plague, cholera, influenza, polio, smallpox, salmonella, tuberculosis, typhus, typhoid fever, syphilis and Spanish flu, etc., some of which can occur again and again in the coming centuries. This is in addition to the emergence of new epidemics in the coming decades, and in the course of the centuries of the third millennium. Already in the present 20th century new epidemics are appearing, and as I said also in the next 21st century. Various new diseases and epidemics will become social threats, which will spread all over the world. STDs will also rage, and claim many victims, as I have already mentioned, in relation to the immunodeficiency pandemic, which, however, will be joined by others who will have terms such as swine flu or severe acute respiratory syndrome in the form of atypical life-threatening pneumonia, that is SARS, which will emanate from China. Several types of avian influenza, that is bird flu, chicken flu, etc., will also spread as epidemics from Asia, as will river fever, that is Ebola fever, and Polygon fever, that is West Nile fever, as epidemics of meningitis and cerebral encephalitis from Africa. But they may also spread a clouding of consciousness, difficulty in swallowing, dizziness, fatigue, exhaustion and permanent headaches, loss of appetite, a feeling of pressure in the right upper abdomen, but also vomiting, and coordination disorders and personality and behavioral changes, and, if left untreated, causes an enlargement of the spleen, as well as inflammation of the kidneys and pancreas, inflammation of the heart muscle, inflammation of the liver and jaundice. Crime, and prostitution etc. must also be addressed again and again, because their causes, from which much disaster will arise in the coming times, well into the third millennium, are to be attributed solely to the degenerations of the world's population, which will in future overflow, and to the irresponsibility, selfishness, and self-assertion of the people. The main culprits are the leaders of the authorities and governments, who must be named as the main culprits, because they, as the leaders of the peoples, are the determining forces who must endeavor to advise the populations properly, and to do everything correctly, in order to avoid all evils as a whole and to lead the world and its humanity into a good, peaceful, free, and livable future. And this included, that mankind would adhere to the maximum number of human beings that would be appropriate for the planet, which calculated for the Earth amounts to 529 million, but which will already be exceeded many times over by the turn of the millennium, and will then continue to rise. But in the end this will lead to manifold catastrophes, because by the machinations of the exuberant world population large parts of the planet will be destroyed by the exploitation of resources, poisoning as well as by buildings of all kinds, just as also enormous masses of manifold refuse will contaminate the seas, land waters, meadows, mountains, and forests etc. What will also happen by atomic radiation, which will spread on wide areas and which will exert hostile to life and fatally also mutation influences on life forms. The enormously growing mass of the Earth's population and its machinations will not only affect the planet itself, but also its climate, nature, plants and living beings, but will also destroy much of it, in such a way, that many things will be irrevocably wiped out. In the future it will also be the case, that many religious and sect believers will officially give up their religion or sect, but on the one hand only for the sake of the murderous terrorist army, their new delusion, or for the sake of adventure. But on the other hand they will keep their old delusion despite the assumed new faith, and their dogmas and faith forms will remain submissive and keep them. That is why they will continue to disregard the natural creative laws, not obey them, and thus prefer darkness to light, and not turn to the real and its truth. From this will emerge the feeling that death is better than life, which is why they will do completely madly, just as many of mankind on earth who no longer look at the security of life, but prefer to die, whether by direct suicide, or by indirect suicide in connection with acts of war or terrorism. Those people who have dedicated themselves to reality, and to the truth that emerges from it, and thus also to the laws of natural creation, and those who will continue to dedicate themselves to the right one in creation, and in this way shape and lead their lives in a just, honorable and worthy manner, will be regarded as crazy and bad, while, as since time immemorial, those who believe in God will be regarded as good people, and thus as good and wise. And this will be the same as it has always been, because religious people and people afflicted with sects will rage in their faith, and do much evil, injustice, and war and terror, for which they are held to be bold, brave and in their lowliness of life for the best and good, while they will insult and despise those who strive for peace and freedom, and thus also for reality and truth as well as for the natural creative laws. All these things will be done by the wrongdoers in the times to come, because their thoughts and feelings, as well as their psyche, their senses and aspirations, their manners and behavior will be corrupted, because they will be unhappy, unfree and dissatisfied with everything that concerns them, just contrary to those who think about reality and truth, to whom insults and shame will be thrown, harm done, suffering done and their lives threatened. But the believers, who in their confused imagination think that they are better and more justified than those who sincerely strive for truth, love, peace and freedom, will hope to achieve immortality through their faith in their lying God, but they will be bitterly disappointed, because they will not find their way out of their doubts, dissatisfaction and cowardly fear. In this way, they will cast malice on the righteous who strive for reality and truth, and live in this way, with derision, sarcasm, ridicule, and cynicism, as it will also be, that they will be blasphemed, accused of deceit, lies, and conspiracy. But it will also be the case, that they will be wrongly punished by jurisdictions, if they openly spread the truth and name the real reality as their opinion. All this is a truth that will arise in the future in ever more blatant ways, will carry and fulfill, as it has also happened since time immemorial, taking the believers in God, the know-it-alls and scientists, the philosophers and all, to whom the perception and recognition of the real natural reality is foreign, to all those people who try to humiliate reality and the given truth as knowledge is, with stupid laughter, insults, and mockery, and whose knowledge is devalued as nonsense, and denigrated as deceit. It will even be the case that there will be mortal danger for those truth-living men who will adhere to the cultivation of mind, reason, and intelligence, the knowledge of truth, and unswervingly to reality. It will also be the case that many new legal systems and new laws will be enacted, which, however, will not refer in one word to the doctrine of the truth, but will, on the contrary, protect false religious convictions and religious and sect believers, because this is allegedly worthy of heaven, and prevents an unfortunate divorce between God and mankind from taking place. Thus wretched people will mingle with humanity, branding those who know the truth as corrupt through lies and slander. All these things, believers of religions and sects will lay hands, or try to lay hands on those who know the truth, and so many believers in their delusion will lead themselves to crime, war and terror, as well as to robbery, lies, slander and betrayal, as well as to all that will seriously damage the nature of their own consciousness and psyche. So it will be the believers in God, who think they are better and greater than those who call them unbelievers, in their unnatural faith, as they have been since time immemorial, who in their delusion do all evil, and promote war and terrorism, demand unworthy punishments for others and themselves take up arms, to use these irresponsibly against their fellow human beings and kill them. And through politics, religions, and sectarianism, murdering and destructive terror organizations will emerge worldwide, which will rape women in masses without feeling or conscience, and will bestially murder, massacre and also blaspheme innocent people. Everything will get out of joint, and no longer have order, which can hardly be maintained in the small, but which cannot be completely restored. The earth itself will also fall out of balance, and no longer have a regular rhythm of the seasons, but through the fault of mankind will bring enormous natural catastrophes and various great calamities, because through the massive human overpopulation to satisfy their desires, needs and unreasonable demands and desires tremendously much of nature and its flora and fauna will be destroyed and even many life forms eradicated. But also fertile lands uselessly obstructed, forests completely deforested and the earth resources completely exploited. And this will happen in the near and far future, as the oceans, streams, rivers and lakes will be fished out and sometimes become unnavigable. And it will be that almost all wildlife will be expelled or exterminated, and hardly more habitat for everything, because the completely irresponsibly fast-growing mass of the earthly mankind will drive the planet, its nature and its fauna and flora conscientiously against the downfall, faster and more radically. The regular course of the celestial bodies will also be disturbed, while the majority of mankind on earth will not respect the voices of those who know the real truth of reality and fight for it in an instructive way in religious delusion, although attempts will be made to silence their voices, which the delusional believers in God will not succeed in doing for a time. But the seed of truth will often, and for a very long time not be sown, because the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life will still long pass unheard before the seed will be sown and bear fruit. Consequently, much good will still spoil and much of the earth will cease to be fertile, just as the air will become heavy to breathe in gloomy slackening. It will result in the absence of any order, as well as a confusion of all rules and values. And when all this will have arrived, then the rest, who still remains of humanity on earth, will have to restore the sublime totality of the world in a very laborious way over many centuries and millennia, and have to clear everything up in peace, freedom, and goodness to put an end to all taken place misdeeds and the general corruption of humanity on earth. But it will come about that humanity on earth will be decimated by epidemics, and the world will be consumed by wars and terrorism with fire. And much will be completely destroyed by the degeneration of the overpopulation mass. And the question is, whether mankind wants to preserve the earth and give it back its original beauty, and whether it can still do that at all. If these very serious predictions are taken into consideration, the fulfillment of which is inevitable, then it must be recognized and understood that in the coming times these will bring great upheavals well into the third millennium, initially in unprecedented prosperity for all strata of the population, as well as tremendous wealth for many who will become multiple millionaires and billionaires. This will make people more selfish, and greedy than ever before, which will also increase crime and violent crime to a great extent, and maliciously corrupt, and abuse all the rules of good. And that will be the case, just as countless people abandon all their good intentions, causing degenerative anarchist machinations, particularly affecting young people and the medieval. And there will also be many among them who make an effort over years or decades, and do much possible to show the world and the individual people a better and good direction and to cause them to evaluation in life. But for many of these people, after some time, months, years, or decades, the old ways they have only suppressed, but not mastered in them, will come to the surface again, and break through to the outside, if they cannot realize their own desires, hopes, and desires in the course of time and consequently cannot confirm themselves, and not dominantly place themselves in the foreground. Their displeasure and desires for power, their vices, addictions, and dissatisfaction, their selfishness and self-importance, etc. will again overcome them, and force them to give up their efforts for a certain time. Consequently they will fall back into their old irresponsible ways of life and behavior and even become slanderous and angry against previous like-minded people. All that is good and progressive, as well as all that is worth living, will be forgotten by many people, and trampled into the dirt, through which also a fall away from all morality and thereby a corruption of morals up to the state. Permitted open and taxable whoremanship will take place, as it will never have appeared before. And further, from the last World War bloody and radical extremist groups will emerge in Nazism-style murderous and criminal, both in Europe, Russia, the USA and in other countries all over the world. But there will also be many delusion-founded and degenerated murderous terrorist organizations, especially in Arab and Near Eastern as well as directly in Asian states and the Orient, as I already explained. But also through America with secret service and warlike machinations. Much disaster will be caused by war, murder and destruction. The various terrorist organizations that will emerge in the coming decades as a result of the US Secret Service crimes and war crimes will spread around the world, as will various later terrorist organizations, which will also emerge through the guilt of the criminal military and Secret Service machinations of the United States of America and claim hundreds of thousands of lives. But also the USA itself will not be spared by this emerging terrorism, especially if at the beginning of the new millennium New York will be hit by much suffering and destruction and the terror will claim thousands of lives. That is World Trade Center equals terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, in which 4 coordinated hijackings took place at the same time and these planes were piloted by Al-Qaeda terrorists to the World Trade Center, the Pentagon and a field near Shanksville, about 100 kilometers east of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, killing a total of thousands of people. Everything is caused by the world domination greed of the USA itself, which will train stupid and thoughtlessly hostile and insidious revolutionaries of different countries of South America etc., as well as Arab faith fanatics etc. like military guerrillas, which will be organized in the background terroristically, and will later attack against the hated hegemonic United States of America, and bring thousandfold death and destruction in their country. But soon thereafter a new, tremendously violent terror organization is formed in the Oriental region, which will lead such a bloody craft as never before under the guise of a religion has taken place. The emergence of this terrorism will also be traced back to America's guilt, and will bring unspeakable suffering to the whole world. This new Islamic, that is Islamist, religious delusional terrorism will become so violent that only the heaviest military deployments and struggles over many years will be able to control it only partially, and only then to defeat it as far as possible towards the end of the second decade in the next millennium. But then it will be mistakenly assumed by all armies and countries involved that this Islamic terror organization will have come to an end, which will by no means be the case, however, because the future view proves that underground, and in a secret way, this terrorist organization will continue to exist worldwide, whereby thousands of fugitives of the original terrorist organization will return unharmed to their home countries or as fraudulent. Refugees will be given shelter and protected in some countries. In particular, the emerging union dictatorship and an autocratic and power-obsessed, but incapable and in various respects incapable state leader in Germany, will stand up for open hands, in order to offer refugees and returnees from the Islamic terrorist organization, that is Islamist state, as well as millions of refugees from developing countries and Arabia, reception and protection. This, however, will lead to a certain Islamization in Europe, but especially in Germany, and will partly be marked by crime and serious violent crimes. Especially this will be the case with criminal and criminal element who, as departures of the Islamic terrorist organization from Syria and Iraq etc., will infiltrate Germany as refugees due to the unpredictable leader of the state and their stupidity, resulting not only in a peaceful Islamization, but a special criminal and criminal Islamization, that is Islamistization. But this will result in catastrophic social conditions and a rapidly spreading crime and crime subculture, which can no longer be reversed even by various new laws and regulations as well as special forces. Especially the stupid and irresponsible leaders of the European countries, who will be trapped in the claws of the union dictatorship, and will only appear to have a say, will then be the ones who will be specially considered and exploited by the returnees and refugees from the Islamist terrorist organization. And this will happen because in the coming times and far into the new millennium, the majority of all powerful states in the world will drive the countries to ruin in their lack of understanding and reasonlessness, in their inability to govern, and in their mania for power, and striving for enrichment over the heads of the peoples. The self-opinionated power-hungry people of the emerging union dictatorship will enact new laws and regulations throughout Europe, malignant and directed against the freedom and peace of countries and peoples, and over time, will transform the union dictatorship into a slave-dominant dictatorship. If in the Orient the only apparent end of the Islamist terrorist organization takes place, however, it results during that time that all other terror and criminal organizations around the world cannot be stopped even by large police, security and military forces. But long before this worldwide terror organization will emerge in Arabia, which will be joined by hundreds of misled people from all over Europe, as well as tens of thousands of young and medieval, misled, work-shy, adventurous, delusional, and criminal people from Arabia and all over the world, who will then spread torture, horrible deaths, rape, and destruction. A dictatorship union will be founded in Europe with its headquarters in Belgium, which will be joined by the European countries. Through this dictatorship, which will be directed by power-addicted rulers, and will be out to bring all European countries under their thumb, but possibly also non-European countries. The traditional hostility of the West against Russia will be rekindled, and together with America, will be badly stirred up by infamous machinations, to possibly provoke a military campaign. In the new millennium the time will come when millions of refugees from African, Asian and Arab countries will flood the European states, because an unpredictable ruler in Germany and participants in the dictatorship union will call for flight behavior in Africa, Arabia, and Asia. As a result, sometime after the turn of the millennium, tens of thousands of criminals, violent criminals and terrorists will smuggle themselves into the countries of the dictatorship union, which no one will be able to control to any great extent. From the beginning of the 1980s, there will also be a great deal of unemployment worldwide, inflation and a rise in public debt, and all kinds of food, other goods, insurance, and things will become more and more expensive. Financial institutions and postal services will deceive peoples to accumulate enormous wealth and immensely remunerate managers, which they will do by laying off a great many workers and closing countless branches, thereby forcing populations to do the work at their own expense and effort of those losers made redundant by banks and postal services, thereby accumulating immense wealth for banks and postal services at the expense of the citizenry and their upper elites. Overall, however, the value of money for the people of the world will fall, especially in Europe with the introduction of European money. This will drive the member states and the populations of the dictatorial union emerging in Europe in particular into horrendous debts, as will result from mismanagement, also financial indebtedness of the peoples, or even threatening bankruptcies of the financial institutions, which can then be prevented several times only by state financial aid. All this cannot remain without consequences, because the peoples will rise up and possibly go for evolution, which then can be the point that, according to an old prophecy, Russia rises up against the government terror of the European Union and America directed against this, and attacks the West overnight, whereby Europe would then be unmarried to its dictatorship, if the dark prophecy should be fulfilled in this way. But this could then also mean, as the same prophecy says, that Europe would then be pacified by Russia, which could then also spread over the world,